Chapter 9 of the Ashiel Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Sargent Gagan. The Ashiel Mysteries by Mrs. Charles Bryce. Chapter 9. The next thing I remember was finding myself lying on the floor, and when I tried to get up, seeing everything in the room swinging about me like the swinging boats at a fair. I don't know how long I'd been unconscious, but at last I managed to stand up and, clinging faint and giddy to the back of the chair, looked again at the motionless figure that sprawled across the writing table. There was a great pool of blood on the polished oak of the floor beneath it, which grew slowly broader as drop after drop dripped down to swell it. With a great effort, I conquered my faintness and staggered out of the room and down the long passage. In the billiard room, Mr. McConachan was still practicing his game. He must have been making a break, for I remember hearing him speak as I opened the door. 27, he said aloud. My voice wouldn't come, and I stood holding on to the doorpost while he, with his back to me, went on potting the red. Thank you, Miss Byrne, he said, without looking around. Then, as I didn't answer, he glanced up and saw by my face, I suppose, that something was very wrong. He came quickly to me, his cue in his hand. What's the matter? He said. Do you feel ill? Lord Ashiel is dead, I said. In the library. Someone shot him. Didn't you hear? Dead, he cried. Uncle Douglas shot? Do you know what you're saying? I heard a shot. It's true, but 5 minutes ago. Surely that was the keeper shooting an owl or something. I shook my head. He's dead, I repeated dully. He looked at me, still incredulous, and then darted forward and caught me by the arm. Here, sit down, he said, and half pushed, half led me to a chair. I saw him run to the bell and tug violently at the rope. Then I believe I fainted again. I think that is all there is to tell you, Mr. Gimlet. You know already that the murderer got clear away, and the next morning footmarks were found outside the window, which proved to have been made by Sir David Southern. I was so idiotic when I was questioned as to mention having spoken to him outside the gun-room door, and to repeat, incidentally, that he had said he had been cleaning his rifle. I never dreamt that anyone could be so mad as to suspect him, but they looked at the rifle and found that it was dirty, so that it must have been discharged again since I saw him, and it appears he did not join in the search for the murderer, and was not seen until it was all over, and so they arrested him and took him away. No amount of evidence could ever make me believe for a moment that he had a hand in this dreadful thing. But, oh, Mr. Gimlet, I see only too well how black it looks against him. What shall I do if you, too, know that I have told you everything, that he did it? You don't, do you? My dear young lady, said the detective, I really can't give you an opinion at present. There are a score of points I must investigate. A dozen other people besides yourself whom I must question before I can form any kind of conclusion. I hope that Sir David Southern may prove to be a much strong man, but beyond that I can't go just at present, and I shouldn't build too much of my help if I were you. I'm not infallible, far from it, and I certainly can't prove him innocent if he is guilty. He stood up, shaking the sand out of his clothes. Let's go on up to the castle, he said. The gates were near at hand. In silence they breasted the steep incline of the drive, which wound and zigzagged up between high banks covered with rhododendron and bracken and grown over with trees. After a quarter of a mile, these gave place to an abrupt, grass-covered slope, whose top had been smoothed and leveled by the hand of man, and from which on the far side rose the castle of Inverashiel. Its stout and ancient framework disguised and masked by the modern addition to the building which faced the approach. A mass of gabled and turreted stonework in the worst style of 19th century architecture, which in Scotland often took on a shape and semblance even more fantastically repulsive than it assumed in the south. The great tower that formed the principal remaining portion of the old building could just be discerned over the top of the flaring facade. But the nature of the sight was such that most of the ancient fortress was invisible from that part of the grounds. Juliet stopped at the turn of the road. "I will leave you here," she said. "You will not want me, I suppose, after you have finished. Will you come to Lady Ruth Worsfold's house and tell me what you think? It is just past the station turning. You will easily find your way, though the house is hidden by the trees. Your luggage will be there already, and as Lady Ruth is going to put you up." Mr. Mark McConachan, or rather Lord Ashiel, as he has now become, was in the act of ending a solitary meal, when Gimlet was announced. He went to meet the detective, forcing to his troubled, lined face a smile of welcome that lit up the large, melancholy eyes with an expression few people could resist. "We are hoping you will undo what has been done," he said. "I look to you to get my cousin out of prison. Surely there must be some other explanation than that he did it. I simply won't believe it." "Well, if there's any other explanation," said Gimlet, "I will try and find it. But the affair looks bad against Sir David Southern, from what I can hear." "Why should he shot through the window?" said Ashiel. "They were both in the same house. Why should my cousin go into the garden, when he had nothing to do but to open the library door and shoot if he wanted to?" "Oh," said Gimlet, "ordinary caution would suggest the garden. But he didn't know, perhaps, whether his uncle would be alone. And as a matter of fact, he was not, was he?" "No, Miss Byrne was with him. By Jove," said Mark, bending forward to light a cigarette, "I shall never forget the fright it gave me when I saw her face. She looked as if she looked perfectly ghastly. I was in the billiard room when she came in, as white as a sheet, and stood there without speaking for a moment, when I imagined every sort of catastrophe except the real one, and all the time I kept thinking it would turn out to be nothing really. As likely as not, women will look hideously frightened and upset if they cut their finger, or see a rat, or think they hear burglars. One never knows. And then at last she got out a few words: 'Lord Ashiel has been shot,' or something of the sort, and fainted." "What did you do?" asked Gimlet. "Well, I had to see him, you know. I couldn't very well leave her in that state, could I? I hung on to the bell for all it was worth, and the butler and footman came running. I told them to look after the young lady and to call her maid, and then I ran off to the library, followed by old Blanston, the butler. You know what we found there? My poor old uncle, dead as a doornail, a hole in the window where the bullet came in, and the floor all around him covered with blood. Ugh, it was horrid. We only stayed to make sure he was dead, and then we left him as we found him, and rushed back to the house to the rest of the household, and to start a chase after the murderer. Of course, the first person I looked for was David Southern, but he wasn't to be found, and so I and 3 men servants ran out at once with sticks and lanterns, and hunted all over the grounds without seeing or hearing anything or anyone. The hall boy had been sent down to fetch the stablemen and chauffeur, and to rout out some of the gardeners, and anyone else he could find, so that we were a decently large party, and I don't think there was an inch of ground we didn't go over of all that lies within the policies. The murderer, however, had plenty of time to get right away, and as it was hopeless to scour the whole countryside in that darkness, for it was as black as your hat, I decided, after an hour of groping about in the shrubberies, that we must leave off and wait for daylight." "What time was it when you abandoned the hunt?" asked Gimlet. "Oh, it was past midnight. I didn't see that any good could be done by sitting up all night. On the contrary, I thought it important that we should all get some sleep while we could, so as to be fresher for the chase when the daylight came. At this time of year it gets light fairly early, so I sent everyone to bed, except two of the Chillies, whom I told to row across the loch to Cernanon and fetch the doctor and police, which I suppose I ought to have thought of before. Then I went to bed myself." "And when did Sir David Southern turn up?" asked Gimlet. "He appeared soon after we started to beat the policies. I hadn't time then to ask him where he had been, and he was as keen on catching the murderer as anyone. Of course, it never occurred to me to cross-question him." "Naturally. Please go on with your narrative." "Well, we slept, so to speak, for 3 or 4 hours, and then James and Andrew came back with the people I had sent for. And now, Mr. Gimlet, I've come to a strange thing, a thing I've been careful not to mention to anyone but you, though I'm afraid it's bound to come out at the trial. When Blanston and I went out of the library, we locked the door behind us, but when I opened it again to let the doctor and the police in, my uncle's body had been moved." "Moved? How?" Gimlet repeated after him. "Oh, not far, but it had been touched by someone. I am ready to swear, though I said nothing about it at the time. When we first found him, he was lying forward on the table with one arm under his head and the other hanging beside him. But when I went in for the second time, he was sitting sideways in his chair with his head and arm in quite a different place. Instead of being in the middle on the blotting pad, they were further to the right on the bare polished wood." Gimlet looked at him keenly. "You are perfectly certain of this?" he said. "Absolutely. Besides, you can ask Miss Byrne and Blanston. They both saw him as he was at first, and the police and Dr. Duncan can tell you what his position was when they went into the room. I said nothing about it to any of them, because I thought at once that it must be David who had been in there." "But why did you think that?" asked Gimlet. "Because he knew where the key was. I took it out of my pocket when we were all alone in the smoking room before going up to bed, and asked him what I should do with it. 'Oh, put it in the drawer,' he said, pointing to the writing table. 'And put it in there.' And I put it in there, as he suggested. Of course, I see now that someone else may have found the key in that drawer, but at first it did look as if David must, for some reason, have taken it and been in the library after I'd gone to bed." "Well, it seems very unlikely that anyone else would hit on the place where you had put it," said Gimlet reflectively. "And if they had done so, would they have recognized the key? Is a library key particular in any way?" "It is a rather uncommon pattern," said Mark. "It is very old and strong. I think anyone who knew the key would have recognized it all right." "It is hardly likely that anyone would have found it if they had to search all through the house for it in the middle of the night," commented Gimlet. "Is there no other way of getting into the library?" "No, there is only one door." "How about the window? It was broken. Could not anyone have put in a hand or raised the sash?" "I don't think anyone could have got in. It isn't a sash window. There are stone mullions and small leaded casements in the old part of the castle where the library is, and I doubt if anyone larger than a child could squeeze through it. It seems very unlikely that anyone else would have. In fact, a child couldn't. There are iron bars down the middle, which make it too narrow." Murmured Gimlet. "I should like to have a look at them. And what was the doctor's report?" "He said that the injuries to the heart were such that death must have been instantaneous, or practically so." "Did anything else come out?" asked Gimlet. "Oh, nothing except the evidence against poor old David, I'm sorry to say." "You haven't told me about that," asked Gimlet. "Go on from where the police arrived on the scene." "Well, as soon as it was daylight, we started off again on our search. But right at the beginning of it, they came upon the footsteps." "Ah, And where were they? The flower bed outside the library window showed them plainly. The ground beyond that was mossy, and there were no other marks. So we divided into two parties, one going west down the side of the loch, and the other north and east over the hills. Till 10 o'clock or later we beat the country, searching behind every rock and going through the woods and bracken in a close line. But we saw no signs of a stranger, and came back at last, dead beaten, for food and rest. When we got back, we found that the policeman left in charge had been nosing about and whiling away his time by collecting the boots of everyone in the house and fitting them to the footsteps on the flower bed. As bad luck would have it, David's shooting boots exactly fitted the marks. "Shooting boots," said Gimlet. "He wouldn't be wearing shooting boots after dinner." "That's what he said himself, and there seems no imaginable reason why he should have worn them, unless—" Mark hesitated for a moment, and then went on in a tone perhaps rather too positive to carry complete conviction to a critical ear. "Of course not. He can't have put them on after dinner. The idea is ludicrous. He must have made those footprints earlier in the day." "Is that what he said himself?" asked the detective. He had finished eating and was leaning back in his chair with that air of far-off contemplation which those best acquainted with him knew was habitually his expression when his attention and interest were more than usually aroused. "No," admitted Mark regretfully, "he doesn't. He sticks to it that he never been near the flower bed, with boots or without 'em. It's my belief his memory has been affected by the shock of all this, and he would insist on talking to the police, though they warned him that what he said might be used against him. I did all I could to stop him, but it was no good. It really looked as if he was doing his best to incriminate himself." "How was it? What else did he say?" asked Gimlet. "You see," said Mark, "when the certain man had gotten hold of the boots that matched the footprints, he was so excited by his success, pleased to death with himself he was, and he was as keen as mustard on following up his rotten clue. The next thing he did was he wanted to look at David's guns. Of course we didn't make any objection to that, though if I had known well, it's no earthly thinking of that now. So off we marched in procession to the gun room, and it didn't take long to see that the only one of the whole lot there hadn't been cleaned since it was last fired was the Mannlicher David had shot his stag with the day before. The silly ass of a constable took it up and squinted through it as solemn as a judge, and then he handed it to my cousin, and 'What have you to say about this, Sir David?' says he. Infernal cheek. 'I shot it off yesterday, and haven't had time to clean it since,' said David. And I, for one, could have sworn he was speaking the truth. Why not? Indeed, there was nothing improbable about it. But the dickens of the thing was that while we were out of the house, he had the whole place to himself. Then the policeman had routed out poor Miss Byrne, and badgered her for an account of all that had happened that evening before. And she, without a trace of thought of doing harm to any of us, I'm convinced, she's as sorry for it now as I am myself had mentioned incidentally that David had told her, when she saw him half an hour before the murder, that he had just been cleaning his rifle. She told me so, too. As far as that goes, when she passed through the billiard room on her way to the library, I happened to ask her if she knew what was he up to." "Decidedly awkward for Sir David," said Gimlet meditatively. "But after all, someone else might have fired off the rifle after it had been cleaned." Mark shook his head gloomily. "There are difficulties about that, too," he said. "It happens that David is very, very fussy about his guns. Always cleans them himself, and won't let any other soul touch them. And though he keeps them in the gun room like the rest of us, he's got his own particular glass-fronted cabinet, which he keeps the key of himself. Now, my uncle and I share one between us, and generally leave the key in the lock, so the keeper can get at the guns, which we never bother to clean ourselves. Oh, not so David. Ever since we were boys, He had his own private cupboard, and no one but himself has ever been allowed to open it. We always spent our holidays here, and my uncle let us behave as if we were at our own house. David took out the key for the sergeant to use, and when he asked if anyone else could have gotten the rifle, he replied that was impossible, as the key had been in his pocket the whole time, except for an hour or two while he was asleep, when it had lain on the table by his bedside. "Did he deny having told Miss Byrne he had cleaned the rifle?" asked Gimlet. "Why, yes, he said he hadn't told her so. It was all very unpleasant, and the police sergeant was as suspicious as you like by this time." "What were you doing when the alarm was given?" he asked David. "Oh, I was out in the grounds," said David, "and that was rather a facer for the rest of us, I must confess." He went on to say that he had fancied he saw someone hanging around at the edge of the lawn, which is the opposite side of the house from the library, and gone out to make sure. But he hadn't found no one, though he hunted about for nearly an hour. Then, till he saw the lights approaching and fill in with our party of searchers, he said that was the first time he heard about the murder. Gimlet nodded his head thoughtfully. "Miss Byrne said she saw him start off to look for someone," he remarked. "Yes," said Mark. "There's no doubt he saw a man lurking in the dark. And it was dark, too," he added. "Never saw such a black night in my life. I must say it beats me how he could have seen anyone. But his eyes were always rather more useful than mine," he concluded hastily. "The police, however, seem to have thought it improbable," said Gimblet, "since they arrested your cousin for the murder." "Stupid brutes," said Mark viciously. "No, they would have it. It was impossible he should have seen anyone, and what clinched it was the unlucky fact that David and my uncle had a violent row the day before. Oh, my uncle shot David's dog. I must say I think it was uncalled for, and poor David was absurdly fond of the beast. He felt very savage about it, and all the ghillies heard what he said to Uncle Douglas." "What did he say?" "Oh, a lot of rot. He lost his temper. The idiotic thing he said was that he had a good mind to shoot him and see how he liked it. Pure temper, you know. I don't believe David would hurt a hair of his head." "Well, it was decidedly an indiscreet remark. Of course, the police heard all about it from the servants and keepers, and it fitted in only too well with all the rest about the footmarks and his absence from the house at the time and the rifle and everything. By and by the bullet was a soft-nosed one which fitted David's rifle. But for that matter it fitted mine, which is a .355 Mannlicher like his, or a dozen others on the lock side. It's a very common weapon on a Scotch forest, but taking one thing with another there was a good deal of evidence against him. So they made up their minds he had done it, and Macross, when he arrived from Glasgow with his myrmidons, agreed with the local idiots and took him off. I'm certain there must be a mistake somewhere, but so far it seems jolly hard to hit on it. I hope you put your finger on the spot." "I hope so," said Gimlet, but his voice was full of doubt. "It's hard to see how anyone else could have used his rifle after he cleaned it, since he admits that he locked it up and kept the key on him. Yes," he murmured to himself, "the rifle speaks very eloquently. What other interpretation can you put on these facts? I'm sure you must see that yourself," he went on, glancing up at Mark, who was feeling in his pocket for another cigarette. "Sir David told Miss Byrne he had cleaned his rifle. He told the police that he locked it up, and that the key had been in his possession ever since. The rifle was found to have been fired again since he had cleaned it. His only explanation was to contradict what he had previously said to Miss Byrne. Do those facts appear to you to leave any possible loophole or doubt to his guilt?" Mark struck a match and lighted his cigarette before he answered. When at length he did so, his reluctance was very plain, and his voice full of regret. "Poor old chap," he said. "I'm afraid he must have done it in some fit of madness. As you say, there is no other imaginable alternative." Gimlet nodded philosophically. "Is there anything else?" he asked. Mark hesitated. "Oh, yes, there's a letter which arrived for Uncle Douglas this morning," he said, "which you may think worth looking at. I dare say it's of no importance, but it struck me as rather odd." He took the letter out of his pocket and handed it to the detective, who opened it and read as follows: "Si Milo ne rend pas ce qu'il ne doit pas garder, le coup de foudre lui tombera sur la tête." But there was no signature nor any date, Gimlet noticed. Then Gimlet turned the sheet over thoughtfully. The message was typewritten on a piece of thin foreign paper. The postmark on the envelope was Paris and the stamps French. He folded it again and replaced it in its cover. "Oh, it seems the usual threatening anonymous communications," he observed. "Have you any idea who it's from?" Mark shook his head. "None," he confessed. "It looks, though, as if my uncle had in his possession something belonging to the writer, doesn't it? Don't you think it might have something to do with the murder?" "Well, I don't see why the murderer should send a threatening letter after the deed was done," said the detective. "Still less could he have posted in Paris on the very day the crime was committed." "No, that's true enough," Mark admitted reluctantly. "Has any suspicious-looking persons been about this place this summer? Any foreigners, for instance?" asked the detective. No, Mark replied. "I should have heard it. For certain, if there had been, it would have been an event down here." So Gimlet dropped the subject. "If I may," he said, "I will keep this. It may lead to something," he added, tucking the letter away in an inside pocket. "Oh, that's all, I suppose." Mark was silent for a minute. He seemed to be thinking. "Well, that's all I know about the murder," he said at last. "But there are plenty of complications apart from that. I suppose Miss Byrne told you that my uncle electrified us all by saying she was his daughter, only an hour or so before he died?" Gimlet nodded. "Yes," he said, "she told me." "It makes it very awkward for me," said Mark. "I want to do the right thing, but I'm hanged if I know what I ought to do. You see, my uncle used to say that he left his property between me and David. He never made any secret of it. And as a matter of fact, I've had a communication from his London lawyers telling me that they have a very old will, made when I was a small boy, long before the birth of his son, and that everything is left to me. There were reasons why he may have thought David would be provided for. He was engaged to marry a very rich American, but she dropped him yesterday like a red-hot coal as soon as it began to look as though he'd be a suspect. She's gone now, I'm glad to say. As a matter of fact, if David can only be cleared of this horrible charge, I shall insist on dividing my inheritance with him. That is, if I can't get Miss Byrne to take it, or Miss McConachan. I guess I ought to call her now." "Lord Ashiel could leave his money where he liked, couldn't he?" Gimlet inquired. "Oh, yes, he could, but he would naturally have left it to his daughter, if she really was his daughter. In fact, Miss McConachan says that he told her he had done so. But I haven't come across the will so far, though I had a good hunt through his papers this morning. Meanwhile, Blanston and the housekeeper, who say they witnessed some document which may have been a will, have no idea where it is, of course. My uncle may have intended to say that he was going to make one, and Miss McConachan may have understood him. But she seems to think he had some secret hiding place of his own, and I hope to goodness you'll be able to hit on it if he had. I can't stand the idea of profiteering by a lost will, and I'd far rather simply hand over the money than bother to look for this missing paper." "Oh, I dare say it will turn up," said Gimlet. "You haven't had much time to find it yet." "Oh, my uncle was a very methodical man. Everything is in its place. You wait till you see his papers. If he made a will, he must have hidden it somewhere. We shall never dream of looking for it. It's just a waste of time hunting about, and I shall have another try at persuading my new cousin to let me make over everything to her. Well, it's not every young man in your position who would part so readily with a large fortune," observed Gimlet. Mark awkwardly deprecated his approving words. "Oh," he said, "I'm sure any decent chap would do the same thing in my place." End of chapter 9. Recording by Kenneth Sargent Gagan. Ten of the Ashiel Mysteries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Sargent Gagan. The Ashiel Mysteries by Mrs. Charles Bryce. Chapter 10. "And now," said Gimlet, "may I visit the scene of the crime?" Mark took him first to his uncle's bedroom, a room austere in its simplicity, with bare whitewashed walls and uncarpeted floor. No one could have hid a sheet of paper in that room, thought the detective, as he gazed round it, after he had looked, with a feeling akin to guilt, on the features of the dead peer. He had not known how to protect this man from the dreadful fate that struck him down from such a direction so utterly unexpected, and he held himself, in a way, responsible for his death. Then young Ashiel led him away, down a wide corridor, into a billiard room, and so into another passage, at the end of which a door of stout and time-darkened oak gave access to the library. It creaked noisily on its hinges as he pushed it open, and ushered Gimlet in. They stepped into a square room, comfortably furnished, with deep armchairs and a large Chippendale writing table, which stood at right angles to the bow window, so placed that anyone writing at it should have the light upon his left. It was rather a dark room, the walls being lined with books from floor to ceiling, except at 2 points. Opposite the window an alcove, paneled in ancient oak, appeared in the wall, and above the fireplace, opposite the door, the wall was paneled in the same manner and covered by an oil painting, representing Lord Ashiel's grandmother. The polished boards were unconcealed by any rug or carpet, and reflected a little of the light from the window. An ominous discoloration near the writing table showed plainly upon them, and the glass in the mullioned casement was a small round hole made by the fatal bullet. Gimlet glanced at the bureau in which writing materials were set out in perfect order, and could not conceal his annoyance. "Everything has been moved, I see," he said. "Why couldn't they leave it as it was for a few hours longer?" "Nothing was touched until after the police had come," said Mark. "I confess I didn't think it necessary to leave things alone once they were out of the house. Not only have the housemaids been here at work, but I spent most of the morning here myself, going through the papers in that bureau. Will it matter much?" He spoke with evident dismay. "Never mind," said Gimlet. "I suppose Macross's people photographed everything, and I can get copies from them. I have no doubt, by the by, what did Sir David Southern say about having been in the room while you were in bed? Did he admit it? And did he say why he moved the body?" "He said he had not been near the place," replied Mark, looking more perplexed and worried than ever. "I can't understand it at all," he added. "Why should he deny it to me?" Gimlet opened a drawer in the bureau. Papers filled it, tied together in bundles and neatly docketed. They seemed to be receipt bills. He glanced at the pigeonholes, and opened 1 or 2 more drawers. Everywhere the most fastidious order reigned. "You've been all through these?" he asked. "Yes, but there's a cupboard full in the smoking room. Thought of looking into those this afternoon." "It would be a good plan," Gimlet agreed. "Don't let me keep you." And as the young man still lingered, "I prefer," he confessed, "to do my work alone. If you will kindly get me a shooting boot of Sir David Southern's, I shall do better if I am left to myself." "Well, if that's really the case," said Mark, "I have no choice but to leave you. I admit I should have liked to see your methods, But if I should be a hindrance—" Gimlet did not deny it, and Mark departed to fetch the boots. "Why, this is not the identical pair," he said when he returned. "The police took those, but these come from the same maker and are nearly the same, so Blanton tells me." "Ah, yes, Blanton," said Gimblet. "I must see him presently. Thank you very much." Left alone, Gimblet examined the window, opening one of the small paned casements, and measuring the space between the mullion and the central bars of iron. Satisfied as to the impossibility of any ordinary sized person passing through those apertures, he took one more look round, and then with a swift movement drew each of the heavy curtains across the bay. They did not quite meet in the middle, as Juliet had observed. Then he made his way into the garden, through the door just at the outside, at the end of the passage which led from the billiard room to the library. The library was at the far end of the oldest portion of the Inverashiel castle. To Gimlet, examining it from the outside, it looked as if the room had been hewn out of the solid walls of the ancient fortress. For behind the mullioned 17th-century window, the wall turned sharply to the left, and was continued with scarce a loophole in the stupendous blocks of stone. It served for a distance of 50 yards or so, where it was succeeded by the lower, less heavy battlements of the old outworks. In the angle formed by the turn, and immediately opposite the window of the library, a long flower bed, planted with standard and other rose trees, with violas growing sparsely in between, stretched its blossoming length, and continued up to the actual stones of the library wall. At the further end of it, a thick hedge of holly bordered on the roses at right angles to the end of the battlements, while the lawn on his left was spangled with geometrically shaped beds showing elaborate arrangements of heliotropes, agaritum, calceolarias. Gimlet walked slowly along the lawn at the edge of the bed, his eyes on the black peaty mole, where it was visible among the flowers. About 20 yards from the hedge he stopped, with a muffled exclamation. The bed in front of him was covered with footprints, of all shapes and sizes, but plainly distinguishable among the rest were those neat, nail-encrusted marks which matched the boot he held in his hand. He put it down on the ground, and carefully made an imprint with it in the soil. Beside the existing footmarks, it was easy to single out its fellow. 2 extra nails, murmured Gimblet to himself, but otherwise the same. Probably made on the same last, he thought. Stepping cautiously in the places where his predecessor had walked, he followed the tracks that had betrayed Sir David Southern. They were numerous and distinct. He counted 14 of each separate foot. First, Sir David would seem to have walked straight across the bed, then returned, and taken up his position near the middle. He was not contented with that, it seemed, for he had walked backwards 5 or 6 paces, and then moved sideways again till he was exactly opposite the opening between the curtains. Here the ground was trampled down as if he had several times shifted slightly from one place to another. Whether or not he was exactly in line with the writing table Gimlet could not see, as its position was hidden in the obscurity behind the drawn curtains. Would want a light there to prove that, thought Gimlet. Still, there was no reason to doubt that it was so. There were 4 or 5 more footmarks leading back to the lawn, and over these Gimlet stooped with particular interest. With a tape measure, which he took from his pocket, he measured the distances between the prints, entering the various figures in his notebook, beside carefully drawn diagrams. Then he picked his way to the edge of the lawn, and stood a moment considering. Apparently he was not satisfied, for presently he retraced his steps delicately to the middle of the bed, till he was once more just behind the place where the earth was trodden down. After pausing there an instant, He turned once more and ran quickly back to the grass, without this time troubling himself to step in the chain of footprints used previously by the police. But he had not even yet finished, and was soon crouching down again, with the tape measure in one hand and the notebook in the other, poring over the evidence so preserved carefully by the impartial soil. At last he got up, put his measure back in his pocket, and walked slowly toward the hedge. He had nearly reached it when something at his feet arrested his attention. He bent over it curiously. Near the edge of the grass, and parallel to it, there was an indentation a little over an inch wide and about the same depth. It extended in a straight line for perhaps 9 inches, and what could have caused it was a puzzle to Gimlet. The turf was broken, and it looked as if an oblong, narrow, heavy object had rested there, sinking a little into the ground, so as to leave this strange mark. Gimlet rubbed his forehead pensively as he looked at it. Suddenly, as his introspective gaze wandered unconsciously over the ground before him, his attention was arrested by a second mark of the same perplexing shape, which he could see behind a rose bush, more than halfway across the bed. Stepping as near the hedge as he could, the detective proceeded to examine this duplicate of the riddle. It seemed absolutely the same, though deeper, as was natural on the soft mold, and he found, by measuring, that it lay exactly parallel to the other. What could it be? He asked himself. A moment later, still another and yet stranger impression caught his eye. It was about the same width, but not more than half as long, and rounded off at each end to an oval. It was situated about a foot from the deep indentation, and rather further from the holly hedge. A tall standard rose tree, covered with blossoms of the white Frau Karl Drowsky rose, grew near it, interposing between it and the house. Gimlet measured it with painstaking precision. Then, with the help of his measurements, he made a life-size diagram of it on the page of his notebook, and studied it with an expression of annoyance. He had seldom felt more at a loss to explain anything. At length, he turned and went back toward the grass. What a track I leave, he thought to himself, looking down ruefully at his own footprints. What I want is... He stopped abruptly as a sudden idea struck him. Then a look of relief stole slowly over his face as he permitted himself a gratified smile. To be sure, he said, and seemed to dismiss the subject from his mind. Indeed, he turned his back upon the rose bed and strolled away by the side of the hedge, which was of tall and wide proportions, providing a spiky, impenetrable defense against observation from the outside of the rectangular enclosed garden. Halfway along it, he came to an arched opening. Passing through this, he found himself in another outer thicket, and immediately upon his right hand beheld a small shed, which stood back, modest and unassuming, in a leafy undergrowth of rhododendrons. Gimlet pushed open the door and stepped inside. The place was evidently a tool house, used by the gardeners for storing their implements. Rakes, spades, forks, and hoes leaned against the walls. A shelf held a quantity of odds and ends, trowels, seedsmen's catalogues, a pot of paint, a bundle of wooden labels, the rose of a watering can, and a dozen other small objects. On the floor were filled boxes and empty cases. Flower pots stood beside a bag which bore the name of a patented fertilizer. A small hand-mowing machine blocked the entrance, and a plank, too long to lie flat on the ground, had been propped slantwise between the floor and the roof. Bunches of bass hung from the nails above the shelf, and on the wall opposite, a colored advertisement representing flocks of so fierce an intensity of hue that nature was put to a blush, had been tacked on by some admirer of art. 5 minutes later, when Gimlet emerged once more into the open, he carried in one hand a garden rake. With this he proceeded to thread his way through the shrubbery, keeping close to the line of the holly hedge, where he thought he had gone about 50 yards. He lay down and peered under the leaves. The hedge was rather thinner at the bottom, and by carefully pushing aside a little of the glossy, prickly foliage, he was able to make out that the end of the rose bed he had lately examined was separated from him now only by the dividing barrier of the hedge. With the rake still in hand, he drew himself slowly forward, gingerly introducing his head and arms under the holly, till he was prevented from going further by the close growing trunks of the trees that formed the hedge. It took some maneuvering to insert the head of the rake through the fence, but he did it at last, and found a gap which his arms would pass also, between and under the lowest fringes of the leaves of the further side. He could see the track of his own footsteps where he had walked on the bed. They were all, by an effort, within reach of his rake, and he stealthily effaced them. He could not see whether the garden was still untenanted, or whether the particular phenomenon of a rake moving without human assistance was being observed by anyone from the castle. He fervently hoped that it was not. He did not wish the attention of anyone else to be called to the puzzling marks that had mystified him, and, as the only window which looked into the garden was that of the library, he thought there was a good chance that there was no one in sight. Cautiously and almost silently he worked his way back, and replaced the rake in the tool house where he had found it. Then he took a small oil can used for oiling the mowing machine, and concealed it under his coat, made towards the house. The little garden was still lonely and deserted as he walked quickly over the lawn and in at the passage door. The library was empty as he had left it, and his first act was to draw back the curtains to their former positions on either side of the window. Then he went to the door, and with a glance to right and left along the passage, and an ear bent for any approaching footsteps, he quickly and effectively oiled the hinges and lock. So now the door closed noiselessly and without protest. When he was quite satisfied on this point, he shut it gently, and took back the oil can to the shed. "Now," said he to himself, "for the gun room." He took up Sir David Southern's shooting boots, which he had left in the tool house during his last proceedings, and made his way through the billiard room into the main corridor beyond on his right. Through an open door he peeped into a large room, obviously the drawing room, and saw that it looked on to the front of the house. The room wore a forlorn aspect. No one, apparently, had taken the trouble to put it straight since the night of the tragedy. The blinds had been drawn down, but the furniture seemed awry, as if chairs had been pushed back hastily. A little card table still displayed a game of patience half set out, and even the dead flowers in the glasses had not been thrown away. The air was stuffy in the extreme, and Gimlet, with a disgusted sniff, pulled aside one of the blinds and threw open the window. But all at once a thought seemed to strike him. For a moment he stood irresolute. Then he slowly closed the casement again, but without latching it, and after frowning at it, thoughtfully walked away. He went back into the hall. Opposite, across the corridor, rose the main staircase, wide and imposing. On each side of it a smaller passage led away at right angles to the entrance, the right-hand one giving access to the rooms in the new front of the castle, one of which he knew to be the dining room. He listened for a minute outside the door beyond it, and heard the sound of rustling papers. The smell of tobacco came to him through the keyhole. It was plain that here was the smoking room, and that the new Lord Ashiel was at that moment engaged in it, and deep in his uncle's papers. The little detective, as he had said, preferred to work without an audience when he could, so he left Mark to his search and stole silently away down the passage. He passed 2 more rooms and paused at the last door, opposite the foot of a winding stair. This, from what Juliet had said, must be the door to the gun room. The door opened readily at his touch, and he stepped inside and shut it behind him. It was a small, bare room, with one large deal table in the middle of it. Gun cases and wooden cartridge boxes were ranged on the linoleum-covered floor, and 3 glass-fronted gun cabinets were hung upon the walls. One, the smallest of these, was of a different wood from the others, and bore in black letters the initials D.S. 3 or 4 guns were arranged in it, 2 12-bore shotguns, an air gun, and a little 20-bore. Another rack was empty. No doubt it held the Mannlicher rifle, which the police had carried away to use as evidence in their case for the prosecution. The door was locked, and there was no signs of a key. Gimlet turned toward the other cupboards. There were more weapons here, and a few minutes' examination showed him that, as Mark had said, he and his uncle were less particular as to where their guns were kept, for the first 2 that the detective glanced at bore Lord Ashiel's initials, and the next was an old air rifle with M.C.C. engraved on a silver disc at the stock. Side by side were the rifles used by the uncle and nephew for stalking. Gimlet knew from Mark that the Mannlicher was his, while Lord Ashiel had apparently used a Mauser or a Ross sporting rifle, as there was one of each in the case. Gimlet lifted down the Mannlicher and laid it on the table. This, then, was the kind of weapon with which the deed had been done. It was a .355 Mannlicher Schonauer, the latest pattern. He opened it and examined the mechanism, which he soon grasped. He squinted down the glistening tunnel of the barrel, and even closely scrutinized the workmanship of the exterior, repressing a shudder at the meticulous design of the chasing of the lock, and passing his fingers caressingly over the wood of which the stock was made. It shone with a rich bloom, as smooth and even as polished marble, except at the butt end, which was crisscrossed roughly to prevent slippage. But wood in any shape has a homely, friendly feeling, as different from any the polisher can impart to a piece of cold stone as the forests, where it once stood upright and lofty, are from the inhospitable rocks of the peaks above them. These unpractical reflections flitted through the detective's mind, together with others of a less fantastic nature. As he put the rifle back in the rack he had taken it from, he closed the glass doors of the cabinet, leaving them unlocked, as he had found them. Then, going back to the table, he took an empty pill-box from his pocket, and, with the utmost care, swept into it a trace of dust from off the bare deal top. There was barely enough to darken the cupboard at the bottom of the box, but he looked at it before putting on the lid, with an expression of some satisfaction. End of chapter 10. Recording by Kenneth Sargent Gagan. Of the Ashiel Mysteries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Sargent Gagan. The Ashiel Mysteries by Mrs. Charles Bryce. Chapter 11. Gimlet left the gun room quietly, and after some more exploring, discovered the way to the back premises. In the pantry he found Blanston, whom he invited to follow him to the deserted billiard room for a few minutes' conversation. "You know," he told him, "Mrs. Byrne and your new young master want me to examine the evidence that Sir David Southern is the author of this terrible crime." "I'm sure I wish, sir," said the man, "that you could prove he never did it. A very nice young man, Sir David has always been. It seems dreadful to think of him lifting his hand against his uncle. I'm sure it ought to be a warning to all of us to keep our tempers. But of course it was very hard on Sir David to have his dog shot before his very eyes." "No doubt," agreed Gimlet. "You were there when it happened, I suppose?" "No, sir, but I heard about it from one of the keepers, and Sir David was very, very much put out about it. So he says. And I quite believe it, seeing how fond he was of that poor creature. Always had it to sleep in his room, he did, sir, though it was rather an offensive animal to the nose, to my way of thinking. But these young gentlemen, what are always smoking cigarettes, get to lose their sense of smell. I've often noticed that, sir. I understand he was very angry indeed, sir. But I should hardly have thought he would go so far as to take his uncle's life. Knowing him, as I have done from a child, I may say I should not have hardly thought of him, sir." "Life is full of surprises," said Gimlet, "and you never know for certain what anyone may do or may not do. Tell me, you were the first on the scene of the crime, weren't you?" "Oh, hardly that, sir. Miss Byrne was with his lordship at the time." Yes, of course. But you saw him shortly after the shot was fired. Did you hear the shot?" Oh, no, sir. The hall is quite away from the tower, and so is the housekeeper's room, and the walls are very thick. We were just finishing supper, which was very late that night on account of the gentleman coming in late from stalking, and one thing and another. I'm rather surprised none of us heard it, sir." "I dare say there was a good deal of noise going on," said Gimlet. "How many of you are there in the servants' quarters?" "Well, counting the chauffeur and the hall boy," replied Blanston, "and including the visitors, maids, who are gone now, we were 16 servants in the house that night, and I'm afraid there may have been rather a noise going on." "Were you all there?" asked Gimlet. "Had no one left since the beginning of supper?" "Oh, no one had gone out of the room or the hall since supper commenced," Blanston assured him. "We were all very glad, as it prevented any of us from being suspect, sir. Though in point of fact, I was saying only last night, when the second footman dropped the pudding just as he was bringing it into the room, that we could really have spared him better than what we could Sir David, sir. But of course it's natural for the household to be feeling a bit jumpy till after the funeral tomorrow. Oh, when that's over, I shan't listen to no more excuses." "Quite so," said Gimlet. "What was the first inkling you got that there was anything wrong?" "Oh, about 10:30. The billiard room bell rang very loud in the passage outside the hall. Before it had stopped, and while I was calling to George, the first footman, to hurry up and answer it, there came another peal, and then another and another. I thought something must be wrong, so I ran out of the room and upstairs with the others. When we got to the billiard room, there was Miss Byrne fainting on a chair, and Mr. McConachan beside her, looking very upset. 'There's been an accident or worse,' he says to his lordship. 'Come on, Blanston, and let's see what it is. And you and others look after Miss Byrne. Fetch her maid. Fetch Lady Ruth.' And with that he makes for the library door at a run, with me following close, though I was a bit puffed with coming upstairs so fast. Just as we came into the library door, he turns and says to me, with his hand on the knob, 'From what Miss Byrne says, Blanston, I'm afraid it's murder.' And before I could more than grasp, he had the door open, and we were in the room. There was his poor lordship, lying forward on the table, his head on the blotter book, and one arm hanging down beside him. Quite dead he was, sir, and his blood all over the floor. Poor gentleman. We left him as we found him and went back. Mr. Connigan locked the door and put the key in his pocket. No one must go in there until the police come, he said. But in the meantime, we must get what men we can together and see if the brute who did this isn't still lurking about the grounds. It will be something if we can catch him and avenge my poor uncle, he said. Gimlet considered for a moment. Are you sure you remember the position you found the body in? He asked. Oh, yes, sir, replied Blanson in some surprise. It was like I told you, his head on the blotter book and one arm with it. He must have fallen straight forward onto the table. Oh, thank you, said Gimlet. One more question. I heard you witness a will for Lord Ashiel a day or two before he died. Yes, sir, I did, and Mrs. Parsons, the housekeeper. How did you know it was a will? We didn't exactly know it, sir. But afterwards, when it came out his lordship had told Miss Byrne he had made one, we thought it must have been that. Oh, I see, said Gimlet. Thank you. That's all I want to know. Gimlet sent for the other servants and interrogated them one by one, but without adding anything fresh to what he had already learned. He went thoughtfully away and sought out Mark in the smoking room, where he found him surrounded by packets of papers, which lay in heaps upon the floor and tables. There's a frightful lot to look through, said the young man despondently, looking up from his self-imposed task. I haven't found anything interesting yet. How did you get on? Do you think those footmarks can possibly be anyone's but David's? The boot you gave me fits them too well to admit of doubt, I'm afraid, said Gimlet. And as the other made a half gesture of despair, you must give me more time, he said. I may find some clue in the course of the next 2 or 3 days. By the by, is your cousin a short man? No, said Mark, he's about my height. Why do you ask? Oh, I had an idea, said Gimlet evasively. But if he's as tall as you, I had better begin again. I think I'll take a little stroll through the grounds, he added, and then back to Lady Worsfold's house and get a bath and a change. I shall see you at dinner time, said Ashiel. I'm dining at the cottage. Au revoir till then. Gimlet went out of the front door and proceeded to make a tour of the castle buildings. Turning to his left, round the front of the house, he passed the gun-room door, and went down a short path which led to the level of the servants' quarters. These were built on the slope of the hill, so that what was a basement in the front of the house was level with the ground at the back. Here more remains of the old fortress were to be seen. The various outbuildings that straggled down towards the loch had all once formed part of the old blockhouses or outlying towers, and as the path descended further down the hill, the detective found himself walking round the precipitous rock from which the single great tower, still standing, the one in whose massive shell the room had been cut, which was now the library, dominated the scene from every side. It had been built at the very edge of the hill, which here fell almost sheer to the level of the lake. The old McConachans had, no doubt, chosen their site for its unscalable position. Indeed, the place must always have been impregnable from that side, the rock offering no foothold to a goat till within 20 feet of the base of the tower, where the surface was broken and uneven, and had, in places, been built up with solid masonry. In the crevices up there, seeds had germinated and grown to tall plants and bushes. Ivy hung about the face of the escarpment like a scarf, and in one place a good-sized tree, a beech, had established itself firmly upon a ledge and leant forward over the path below in a manner that turned the beholder giddy. Its great roots had not been able to grow to their full girth within the cracks and crannies of the rocks. Some of them had been pushed their way in through the gaps in the masonry, and others curled and twisted in mid-air, twining and interlacing in an outspread canopy. Beyond the tower ran the battlement wall of the enclosed garden, its foundations draped in the thrifty vegetation of the rocks. At Gimlet's feet, on the other side of the path, brawled a Byrne, hurrying on its way to the loch, and he followed its course slowly down the place where it mingled with the deep waters. A little beyond, he saw the point of a fir-covered peninsula, and wandered under the trees until he came to the end of it. There he sat down to think over what he had heard and seen that afternoon. The wild beauty of the place soothed and delighted him. He felt lazily in his pocket for a chocolate. Below him, gray lichen-grown rocks jutted into the loch in a tumble, broken masses piled heedlessly one on the other, as if some troll of the mountain had begun to play to make a causeway for himself. The great stones, so old, so fiercely strong, stood knee-deep in the waters, over which they seemed to brood with so patient and indifferent a diligence that human life and affairs took on an aspect very small and inconsiderable. They were like monstrous philosophers, he thought, oblivious alike to time and to the cold waves that lapped their feet, their heads crowned here and there with pines as with scattered locks, the little tufts of heather and ferns and grasses that clung to them wherever root-hold could be found, all the clothing they wore against the bitter blasts of the wind. While he sat there, a breeze got up and ruffled the loch. The ripples danced and sparkled like a cinematographer, and waves threw themselves among the rocks with loud gurglings and splashings. The air was suddenly full of the noise and hurry of the waters. He got up and went to the end of the peninsula. In spite of the dancing light upon the surface and the merry sounds of the ripples, the water, he could see, was deep and dark. A little way out, a pale, smooth stone rose a few feet above the level of it, its tops draped in a velvet green shawl of moss. A fat seagull sat there, nor did it move when he appeared. A little bay ran in between the rocks, its shore spread with gray sand, smooth and trackless. At least so Gimlet imagined it at first, as his eyes roamed casually over the beach. Then suddenly, with a smothered ejaculation, he leaped down from his perch of observation and made his way to the margin of the water. There, scored in the sand, was a deep furrow, reaching to within a foot of the waves, where it stopped, as if it had been wiped out from a slate with a damp sponge. Gimlet had no doubt what it was. A boat had been beached here, and quite lately. A glance at the stones surrounding the bay showed him that the water was falling, for in quiet little pools within the outer breakwater of rocks, a damp line showed on the granite a full quarter of an inch above the water. By a rapid calculation of time it would take for that watermark to dry, the detective was able to form some idea of the rate at which the loch was falling. He had thought he could judge the slope of the beach sufficiently well to calculate about how long it was since the track in the sand had reached to the brink of the water. It was a rough guess, but if he were right, then a boat had landed in the bay some 42 hours ago. But there were other traces besides. The tracks of him who had brought the boat ashore from where Gimlet stood. A double row of footprints, going and returning, showed plainly between the water and the stones to which the sand quickly gave place. They were the tracks left by large boots with singularly pointed toes and with no nails on the soles. Emphatically not boots such as any of the men in these parts would be likely to wear. Gimlet bent over the sand. When he rose once more and stood erect upon the beach, he saw, under the shadow of the pines, the figure of a tall, thin man with a lean face and scraggly reddish mustache, who was watching him with an eye plainly suspicious. He was dressed in knickerbockers and a coat of rough tweed of a large checkered pattern, and carried a spyglass slung over his back. The detective went to him at once. "Are you employed on the Inverashiel estate?" he asked civilly. "I'm Duncan McGregor, his lordship's head keeper," was the reply, given in the cold tones of one accosted by an intruder. Gimlet hastened to introduce himself and to explain his presence, and McGregor condescended to thaw. "I should be very much obliged," said Gimlet, "if you would take a look at the sands where you saw me standing. I'd like to know your opinion on some marks that are there." The keeper strode down to the beach. "A boat will have been here," he pronounced after a rapid scrutiny. "Lately?" asked Gimlet. He saw the man's eyes go, as he had done, to the watermarks on the rocks. "Not so very long ago," he said. "I'm thinking it had been the night before. That's when she came in." "Ah," said Gimlet. "I'm glad you agreed with me. That's what I thought myself. Do boats often come ashore on this beach?" McGregor considered. "Well, it's the first time I've ever heard of anybody doing the like," he said at last. "The landing stage is at the other side of the point. It's there they land. There's not a man in this glen who would come in here unless it were for some special reason. It's not a very grand place to bring a boat, and the rocks are narrow at the mouth." "Well, do strangers often come here?" said Gimlet. "Oh, there are no strangers to Inverashiel," said the keeper. "The high road runs at the other side of the loch through Syrian, and the tramps and motors go over it, but never had I known of that kind on our shore." Gimlet observed with some amusement that the man spoke of motors and tramps as a variety of the same breed, but all he said was, "Could you make inquiries as to whether anyone on the estate happens to have brought a boat in here during the last week? I should be glad if you could do something without mentioning my name or letting anyone think it's important." Gimlet felt he could trust the discretion of this taciturn Highland. "All that, sir," was the reply. And Gimlet could see, in spite of the man's unchanging countenance, that he was pleased at this mark of confidence in him. "By the way, could you take me to the head gardener's house?" he asked, abruptly changing the subject. "I should rather like to talk with him." So McGregor conducted him down the road to the lodge. "It's in here where Angus Malcolm lives," he remarked laconically. "Good evening, sir." Then he turned and strode away over the hillside, and Gimlet knocked at the door. It was opened by the gardener, and he had a glimpse through the open doorway of a family at tea. "Oh, I'm sorry to disturb you," he said. "I will look in again another day. Lord Ashiel referred me to you for the name of a rose I asked about, but it will do tomorrow." The gardener then assured him that his tea could wait, but Gimlet would not detain him. "I shall no doubt see you up in the garden tomorrow," he said. "The roses in that long bed outside the library are very fine, and I am interested in their culture. I wonder they do so well in this peaty soil." "Ah, man, they get on splendid here," said Malcolm, who, of course, liked nothing better than to talk about his flowers, but, being a Highlander, resented any suggestion that his native earth was not the best possible for no matter what purpose. "We just give them a good dressing down with manure." "By the way, do you use any patented fertilizer?" Gimlet asked. "Oh, just a wee bit of slag now and then," said the gardener, "and I just give 'em some lime when I think the ground needs it." "Well," said Gimlet, "the results are very good. By the way, have you been working on that bed lately? I picked this up among the violas. Did you happen to drop it?" He took from his pocket a small notebook, and held it out interrogatively. "No, I didn't drop it," answered the gardener. "It might have been some one from the castle. I haven't been near that rose bed for 4 or 5 days, and it couldn't have been lying there before the rain." Indeed, the little book showed no trace of damp on its green cover. "I asked in the castle, but no one claimed it," said Gimlet. "Perhaps it belongs to one of your men." "There's nobody been working there this week. so it doesn't belong to none of the gardeners. If it's there, you found it," repeated Malcolm. "There's been no work on that bed for the last fortnight or more. I was thinking of sending a loon over there with a hoe in a day or two. You see, with the murder, it's been impossible to get our work done. Apart from that, we've been busy with the fruit and other things." "I didn't notice any weeds," said Gimlet. "But I won't keep you any longer. Now, perhaps tomorrow afternoon I may see you in the garden, and if so, I shall get you to tell me the name of that rose." End of chapter 11. Recording by Kenneth Sargent Gagan.
Of the Ashiel Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ashiel Mystery by Mrs. Charles Bryce. Chapter 12. Juliet failed to extract much comfort from Gimlet when, about 6 o'clock, she met him coming up through the garden to Inverashiel Cottage. All the afternoon she had possessed her soul in what patience she could muster, which was not a great deal. Still, by dint of repeating to herself that she must give the detective time to study the facts, and opportunity to verify them at his leisure and in his own way, she had managed to get through the long inactive hours, and to force herself not to dwell upon the vision of David in prison, which, do as she would, was ever before her eyes. Events had followed one another so fast during the last few days that her mind was dulled, as by a succession of rapid blows, and she was hardly conscious of anything beyond the unbearable pain caused by the cumulative shocks she had undergone. First had come the heart-rending knowledge that David loved her, heart-rending only because he was bound to Miss Tarver, for, if it had not been for that paralyzing obstacle, she knew she would have gladly followed him to the ends of the earth. Indeed, in spite of everything, his betrayal of his feelings towards her had filled her with a joy that almost counterbalanced the hopeless misery to which, on her more completely realizing the situation, it gradually gave place. Then had come the swift physical disaster from which she had barely escaped with her life. She had not had time to recover from this when, a few hours later, she had been called upon to face the emotions and agitations aroused by the news of her relationship to Lord Ashiel, and the history of her birth and parentage. In the midst of this excitement had come the sudden tragedy of which she had been a witness, and which had overwhelmed and prostrated her with grief and horror. Next day she had been obliged to undergo the ordeal of being cross-questioned by the police, and close upon that had come the final catastrophe of David's arrest and departure. This last shock so overshadowed all the rest of her misfortunes that it stimulated her to action, and she had herself run most of the way to the post office, 2 miles down the road, to send the telegram of appeal to Gimlet. Once that was dispatched, hope revived a little in her heart. Lord Ashiel, her father, had told her to send for the detective if she were in trouble. Well, she was in trouble. She had sent for him. He would come, and somehow he would find a way of putting straight this hideous nightmare in which she found herself living. How happy, in comparison, had been her life in Belgium, in the household of her adopted father and stepmother. She could have found it in her heart to wish she had never left their roof. But that would have involved never making the acquaintance of David, a possibility she could not contemplate. Even now the remembrance of the rapidity with which Miss Tarver had packed her traps, renounced her betrothed and all his works, and fled from the scene of disaster by the first available train, did much to cheer her in the midst of all her depression. It was not, however, until some time after Lady Ruth Worsfold had asked her to stay with her for the present, and she had removed herself and her belongings to the cottage, that she realized how impossible it was for her to make good her position as Lord Ashiel's daughter and heir. She had his word for it, and that was enough for her, but she understood, as soon as it occurred to her, that more would be required by the law before she could claim either the name or the inheritance which should be hers. In the meantime, though touched by the generosity of the new Lord Ashiel, who offered to waive his rights in her favour, and indeed suggested other plans for enabling her to remain at the castle as its owner, she felt that what he proposed was absolutely impossible, and while she thanked him, declined firmly to do anything of the sort. At the back of her mind was the conviction that the will her father had spoken of would come to light. It would surely be found, if not by herself, then by Gimblet. She acceded to Mark's request that she should join him in looking through his uncle's papers. They went over those in the library together before she left the house. Now that Gimblet had come back from the castle, where he had spent half the day, he must have good news for her, she felt persuaded. But to all her questions he would only reply that he had nothing definite to tell her, and that she must wait till tomorrow, or even longer. Indeed, she thought he seemed anxious to get away from her, and asked at once if he might see his room. "I want a bath more than anything," he said. And then, taking pity on her distress, "I wouldn't worry myself too much about Sir David's safety if I were you," he added, looking at her with a very kind, friendly light in his eyes. But as she exclaimed joyfully and pressed him to be more explicit, his look changed to one of admonition, and he held a forefinger to his lips. "Not a word to a living soul, whoever it may be," he cautioned her. "And be careful not to show any hope you may be so optimistic as to feel," he added, smiling, "or you may ruin the whole thing. This is a very dark and dangerous affair, and the less it is spoken about, even between friends, the better." "Mayn't I even tell Lady Ruth?" she asked. "She is very anxious, I know." "Better not," he warned her. "It may be better for Sir David in the long run if his friends think him guilty a few days longer. It will be wisest if you let it appear that even you can hardly continue to cling to the idea of his innocence. You can be trusted to act a part where such great issues are involved, can you not? More may depend on it than you think." "I'll be silent as the grave," she cried. "As the grave," she repeated more soberly, and turned away, reproaching herself silently, since in her anxiety for David her sorrow for her father had been a moment forgotten. When Gimblet came down again, clean and refreshed, he found no one but his hostess, Lady Ruth Worsfold. Lady Ruth's hair was white, in appearance she was short and squat, and she had a curiously disconnected habit of conversation. But for all that, she was a person of great discernment, and uncommonly wide awake. She sided staunchly with Juliet in her belief in David's innocence. "Never," she said, "will I credit such a thing of the lad. You may say what you like, Mr. Gimblet. You can prove till you're black in the face that he murdered every soul in the house. It won't make any difference to me." "Who do you think did it, Lady Ruth?" Gimblet asked. "What do I know? An escaped lunatic, one of the keepers, the under housemaid, anyone you like. What does it matter? It wasn't David, even though his namesake did kill Goliath. And I always disliked the name, having suffered from a biblical one myself. I said to his mother when he was born, 'For goodness' sake, give the poor child a name he won't be expected to live up to. Just fancy how his friends will hate to be known as Jonathan's, let alone Thingamy's wife. You're laying up a scandal for your son,' I told her. And if my words haven't come true, it's more thanks to him than to his parents. A nice pink and white baby he was, poor boy. There's just one good side to this dreadful affair," she went on without a pause, "and that is that the young lady with the dollars whom he was to have married and hated the sight of has thrown him over. The first least little breath of suspicion was enough for her, and the moment he was downright accused she was off. And he's well rid of her, dollars and all. An Englishman of his birth and looks doesn't need to go to Chicago for a wife." "Was Sir David in need of money?" asked Gimblet. "He hasn't got a penny," said Lady Ruth. "Not a red cent, as that terrible young woman put it. His father left everything to the moneylenders, so to speak, and David couldn't bear to see his mother poverty-stricken. He did it entirely for her sake, got engaged, I mean. But I don't think he'd have been such a self-sacrificing son if he'd met Miss Juliet Byrne a little earlier in the day." "Indeed," said Gimblet. "I thought Miss Byrne seemed very much worried about his arrest." "Worried? Poor child, she's the ghost of what she was a few days ago. Half drowned, too, when it happened, which made it worse for her." "She must have had a narrow escape," Gimblet remarked. "What was the name of the man who pulled her out of the river?" "Andy Campbell. He had been stalking with Mark McConachan." "Was young Lord Ashiel with him?" "No, he was on ahead. He saw Juliet in the distance, just going up to the waterfall, but he seems to have taken her for Miss Romaninov, which is odd, because they aren't in the least like one another, one being tall and the other short, in the first place, and one fair and the other dark in the second. He can't have looked very carefully. However, he was very positive about it till they both assured him that Julia Romaninov had turned and gone home some time before she had reached the top pool. And I certainly should have, in her place. It doesn't amuse me scrambling over rocks and scratching my legs in bramble bushes. The path Andy came by goes along high above the water for half a mile. I hate walking on a height myself, and for most of that distance the river is not in sight. If he hadn't been thirsty and come down to the waterside for a drink at a spring nearby, he would never have seen Miss Byrne floating down the stream, and she would have been in the loch pretty soon. It just shows how much better it is to drink water than whiskey." "It was lucky he did," said Gimblet. "Does the path pass inside of the pool she fell into?" "No. The banks are high there, and you can't see down into the pool unless you go to the very edge of the precipice. I did it once, to look at the waterfall, and I very nearly joined it. It's a nasty giddy place, though why one should feel inclined to throw oneself down I can't imagine. But it seems a natural instinct, and it's certainly easier to go down than up." "It appears most miraculous that she wasn't drowned," said Gimblet. "She certainly can have been in no fit state to bear the events that followed." "No, indeed. She has lost everything, father, family, and lover at one blow. You know Lord Ashiel said she was his daughter, and told her he'd made a will leaving everything to her. For that matter, the lawyers say he didn't. Not that I should ever believe anything a lawyer said. They always mean something you wouldn't expect from their words. They do it, I believe, to keep in practice for trials, you know, where they have to make the witnesses say what they don't mean, poor things. And what I shall have put into my mouth by them if I'm called as a witness against poor David doesn't bear thinking of. But the Lord knows what Ashiel did with the will, and, as I was saying, it can't be found." "So I heard," said Gimblet. "You talk of being called as a witness, Lady Ruth. Do you know anything about the case? Where were you when the shot was fired?" "Oh no," she said. "I shouldn't have anything to tell, but I don't suppose that will matter. They'll twist and turn my words till I find myself saying I saw him do it with my own eyes. My poor dear husband, when I first met him, was an eminent Queen's Counsel, as you may know, Mr. Gimblet, so I have a very good idea what they're like. I refused him point blank when he proposed, but he proved to me in 3 minutes that I'd really accepted him, and it was the same thing ever after. A wonderfully brilliant man, though slightly trying at times, especially in church, where he always snored so unnecessarily loud, or so it seemed to me. I often think deafness has its compensations, though I'm sure I ought to be thankful at my age that my hearing is still so acute. However, I didn't hear the shot the other night, but the castle walls are thick even in that detestable modern edition, and besides, Julia Romaninov has got such a tremendously powerful voice." "Were you talking to her?" "Oh dear, no. I was playing Patience, and she was singing, while Miss Tarver murdered the accompaniment. We little thought at the time that someone else was murdering poor Ashiel while we were sitting there in peace. I must say that girl sings remarkably well, and it was a pity there was no one who could play for her, though it wasn't for want of practice on Miss Tarver's part. The moment we were out of the dining room she would sit down at the piano, and they would neither of them stop till bedtime." "Had they both been playing and singing all that evening?" "Yes. They hadn't ceased for a moment, and I found it prevented the demon from coming out, as I couldn't help counting in time with the music. It was all right when it was 1, 2, 3, but common time muddled it dreadfully, though now I come to think of it, Julia was not actually in the room when we heard the bad news. She'd gone upstairs to look for a song or something. Of course there's no legal proof that Juliet really is his child," Lady Ruth continued. "She admits that he was rather vague about it, fancied a resemblance, in fact. Not that I or anyone else had any notion he had been married as a young man, but that's a thing he would be likely to be right about. I must say Mark has behaved extremely well about it, even quixotically. He wanted her to take his inheritance, and when she refused, and of course she couldn't decently do otherwise, I'm blessed if he didn't ask her to marry him." Gimblet looked up with more interest than he had yet shown. "Do you mean to say that he proposed that, merely as a way out of the difficulty?" "Well, more or less. I don't say he isn't attracted by the pretty face of her, as much as his cousin was. Privately, I think he is, but I don't really know. Anyhow, it certainly would be a very good solution. But it was tactless of him to suggest it with David at the foot of the gallows, poor boy." "She didn't tell me that," murmured Gimblet. At that moment Juliet came into the room, and they talked of other things. "I hear the post is gone," Gimblet said presently. "I particularly wanted to catch it. I suppose there's no means of posting a letter now?" The last train had gone south by that time, however, so there was nothing to be done till the next day. He retired again to his room and gave himself up to his correspondence. First a long letter to Macross in Glasgow, begging for the loan of prints of the photographs taken by the police during their visit, together with any details they might see fit to impart as to their observations and conclusions. "I have arrived so late on the scene that you have left me nothing to do," he wrote deceitfully, "but for the interest of the case I should like to have a look at the photographs." He did not expect to get much help from Macross. Then he took from his pocket the pill box in which he had stored the dust so carefully collected in the gun-room. He wrapped it carefully in paper, and addressed the small parcel to an expert analyst in Edinburgh. He wrote one more letter, and then went downstairs again. The dressing-bell sounded as he opened his door, and at the foot of the staircase he met the two ladies on their way to dress. "Dinner is at 8, Mr. Gimblet," Lady Ruth told him. "I want to ask if you would mind my not coming down. I am subject to very bad headaches after a long journey, and as I want particularly to be up early tomorrow, I think the best thing I can do is to go straight to bed and sleep it off. It is poor sort of behaviour for a detective, I am aware, but I hope you will forgive it." "You must certainly go to bed if you feel inclined to," said Lady Ruth. "But you will have some dinner in your room, will you not? They shall bring you up the menu." "No, really, thanks. I shall be better without anything. I know how to treat these heads of mine by now, I assure you, and I won't have anything to eat till tomorrow morning. The only thing I need is quiet and sleep. If you will be so very kind as to give orders that I shall not be disturbed." Of course," said his hostess, full of concern. "And you must let me give you an excellent remedy for headaches. It was given me years ago by dear old Sir Ronald Tompkins, that famous specialist, you know, who always ordered everyone to roll on the floor after meals, and I invariably keep a bottle by me." And she hurried off to fetch it. Gimblet accepted it gratefully, and as he passed a hand across his aching brow, said he felt sure it would do him good. Once again within his own room, however, the detective's headache seemed to have miraculously vanished, and he showed himself in no hurry to go to bed. Instead, having locked the door and drawn down the blind, he sat down in an arm-chair and gave himself up to reflection. Mentally he rehearsed the facts of the case as far as they were known to him, and was obliged to admit that he found several of them very puzzling. There were other problems, too, not directly connected with the murder, of which he could not at present make head or tail. For instance, where was he to find the documents which he knew it was Lord Ashiel's wish he should take charge of? He had promised that he would do so, and the recollection of his failure to guard the first thing the dead peer had entrusted him with made him the more determined that he should carry out the remainder of his promise. But how was he to begin his search? He had so little to go on, and he dared not hint to anyone what he wished to find. Yet if he delayed, it was possible that young Ashiel would come across the papers in his hunt for his uncle's will, and Gimblet felt there was danger in their falling into the hands of anyone but himself. He took out his notebook and studied the dying words of his unfortunate client. Gimblet, the clock, 11, steps. Or was it steps? Considering that he had lived in dread of a blow which should descend on him out of Russia, the last seemed the more likely. There was the strange circumstance of the bodies being found by the police in a position differing from that described by those who first saw it. Young Ashiel, Juliet, and the butler all agreed that it had fallen forward onto the blotting book in the middle of the table. But Mark had told him that on his return with the police the attitude had been changed. Had he been mistaken? Macross's photographs would show. But if not, and the murdered man had really shifted his position, what did it prove? That they had been wrong in thinking him dead? The doctor's evidence was that the wound he had received must have been instantly fatal, or almost instantly. Then someone must have moved the body, and who but David knew where the key of the room had been put away? But why should David have moved him? Then there was the letter which had come 2 days after the murder. The letter written in French and posted in Paris, but probably not written by a Frenchman, and so timed as to reach the destination too late. Was it intentionally delayed, or would Lord Ashiel's death come as an entire surprise to the writer? It certainly would if the police were right, and Sir David Southern guilty of his uncle's death. But was he guilty? Gimblet thought not. These and other suggestions occupied the detective's mind so completely that half an hour passed like a flash, and it was only when the noise of the dinner bell broke in upon his meditations that he roused himself and pulled out his watch. Then he sat upright and listened. His room was above the drawing-room, and he could hear Lady Ruth's clear, rather high voice mingling with the deep tones of a man's in a confused murmuring duet, which after a few moments died away and was followed by the distant sound of a closing door. It was not difficult to deduce from these sounds that Lord Ashiel had arrived, and that the little party of three had gone in to dinner. It was half an hour more before Gimblet rose and walked quietly over to the window. He drew the blind cautiously aside and looked out. Already the days were growing shorter, and the little house, embowered in trees and shut in by a tall hill from the western sky, was nearly completely engulfed in darkness. Below him, on the right, he could just discern the top of a porch, and beyond it a faint glow of light rose from the window of the dining-room. It did not need a very remarkable degree of activity to clamber from the window to the porch, and so down to the ground. To Gimblet it was as easy as going downstairs. In 2 minutes he was stealing away under the trees in the direction of Inverashiel Castle. "The worst of this Highland air," he said to himself as he walked along, "is that it makes one so fearfully hungry, even here on the west coast. I could have done very nicely with my dinner, but such is life, and it's lucky I am not entirely without provisions." So saying, he took a box of chocolates from his pocket and began to demolish the contents. End of Chapter 12. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com.